Our next speaker is Chris Williams. Chris began work at New Economics Foundation in 2011 as the Marine Socioeconomics Coordinator, managing a project to enhance UK marine NGOs' capacity to engage with key socio-economic debates relating to fisheries and the use of the marine environment. A key goal is to foster greater levels of sharing and collaboration among NGOs, specifically those working on marine conservation and fisheries. Before New Economics Foundation, Chris worked for Natural England, which is the UK's nature advisory body leading on the Marine Protected Areas project, and built strong links with Sussex Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority. From 2004 to 2008, he initiated and conducted conservation and development projects in the Americas and Africa. He set up marine conservation projects and ran small-scale development projects in rural areas for a UK-based charity. Chris holds a bachelor's degree in biology and North American history, that's weird, and politics from Sussex University, and a master's degree in environment and development with Spanish from King's College in London. He is a member of his local community land trust and Lewes Transition Town. Thank you, Chris.
Hi there. I've done the exact opposite of David, and I've gone for the PowerPoint overkill. So if you'll allow me to try and paint a picture of what's going on in fisheries, I could easily just talk about ownership models in a lot of detail, but I'm going to try and, assuming that most of you don't work in fisheries, try and give you a better understanding of what's going on and how ownership is related to the debate. As Jane just mentioned, 10 years ago, I spent 5 years working in the developing world with artisanal fishermen. Artisanal means for local markets and local consumption, and it kind of links into what David was saying. For these people, it's absolutely, they depend on it 100% for their protein, they depend on it for their livelihood, and for other people, we mash it up and use it as fertilizer or as health products or anything else. So, 1.5 billion people worldwide rely exclusively on fish protein for their survival. So it is a very big deal. I then came back to the UK and worked with Natural England with inshore fishermen and the government helping to set up a series of marine protected areas, partially to deal with some of the issues associated with overfishing. And then for the last 2 years I've been working with NEF. I've brought a lot of our literature, which is out on the table outside, which is all there for free for you if you're interested to find out more. But we're a think tank that does a lot of research in loads of different directions. We work on banking reform, we work on social policy, criminal justice, land reform, and I'm in the environmental economics team that works on mainly fisheries. And the reason for that is that last year was the year that the common fisheries policy in Europe was reformed. So every 10 years there's an opportunity, and we set up and are a steering group member of Ocean 2012, which is a coalition of nearly 200 environmental NGOs that wanted to see an end to overfishing and sustainable and responsible management of European fish stocks. I've brought again some literature that we've produced from them outside if it's of interest to you. We mainly advocate the fact that fishermen's interests need to be aligned with the best interest of society. It is a public good, it belongs to all of us, it shouldn't be managed purely in the interest of a small number of corporations or, God forbid, a supermarket such as Tesco's. So what we actually do is apply a social return on investment approach to fisheries, which is something that hasn't been tested before, but it's something that works very well. And when you look at the various different impacts that fisheries had, you can actually determine which ones create real value to society and which ones actually lose value. But I'll talk about that a bit more later. The project I actually run is a capacity building project for environmental conservation NGOs, mainly working on marine issues. And the reason I suppose I'm talking here is because our last piece of work was 11 briefings, essentially 11 things you need to know about economics and how economics is used in policy making, and one of them was about ownership and property rights, and the case studies I wrote were about, surprise, surprise, about fish. In terms of this presentation, I'm going to go through a bit of the context, talk about property rights in general, then relate them to fishing, talk about management, and then talk about the big issue in fishing, which is quota, as I'm sure you're all aware, and then I'll try and tie it all together in a way to complete that picture of what's going on. As previous speakers have said, We're obviously living far beyond our means. That doesn't mean that every one of the 7 billion people on planet Earth is doing so. It's more obviously in Western countries where people are using, if we were all living like an American, we'd be using 5 planets. If we were all living like an English person, we'd be using 3. So that kind of shows how unequal our use of the global biocapacity is. Fishing is no different, surprisingly. You can see here this top line is the amount of fish that has been landed worldwide from the ocean. The straight line is human population growth, now well above 6 billion, and this crossed line here is aquaculture. So you can see there's actually a massive shortfall as well between what we can catch, what we can grow in terms of fish, and what we actually need to feed our population. Essentially, we're in a situation now where we're living off the capital rather than off the interest. That's one way of putting it. The fish stocks have been depleted to a point where they can't regenerate and we can't fish them at their maximum sustainable yield, which could obviously continue in perpetuity. As the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment showed, what we're doing to the marine environment is one of the most extreme cases of mismanagement, and often these problems come about because of unclear ownership or the unclear definition of ownership. So, again, we find out that this thought that property is fundamental. Obviously, you can't really have a market economy without property rights. You have to be able to sell and trade those rights, otherwise the market doesn't function. So that obviously has some practical challenges when you're looking at things like the atmosphere, for example. But there's also theoretical problems with it, which we relate to non-rival consumption, access rights, and the unintended side effects of use. Non-rival consumption is the, forgive me if you are very, very familiar with this, but I thought I'd go through, start basic and finish more complicated. Refers to the capacity of goods not to be used up. So something like a lighthouse, it doesn't matter if 300 people are using it or 500 people are using it. These additional consumers have no impact on the commodity, so enforcing private property regimes is effectively pointless. In order to do that, the commodity really needs to be consumed so that the supply and demand function can take over, as otherwise these commodities will be undersupplied if a market is left to itself. Access rights is more about, if you have a house and you don't want people to come into it, you can just lock the door or you can build a fence, but obviously that becomes very, very hard to do when you're talking about open seawater. The chart down there shows the UK territorial waters. It's an area that's considerably bigger than our landmass and obviously very, very hard to police. So public goods such as open seawater obviously have issues of management and of being able to enforce those access rights. Because it's very hard to do, it obviously means that they often get overused or overfished, as we're talking about now, which is a classic example of tragedy of the commons, which featured in pretty much every presentation and probably will continue to. A single fisher doesn't obviously intend to overfish and deplete the stocks, but in sort of cumulatively, all of their effects mean that you have less healthy fish around, therefore over time you're depleting the stock and you end up in the situation that we're in today. So what that means is that the negative externality that's paid for by others, in this case, is wider society. We're all losing out as a result of not having as much fish protein, not as many jobs, not as much revenue as we could do from if we managed fish stocks differently. So that negative externality is currently borne by us, the taxpayer or the citizen. Positive externalities also exist. A lighthouse built in the UK that's used by Dutch sailors, for example, would be an example of that. So the real question is, what's the best way to allocate? And for things like the Earth's atmosphere and for the ocean, I'm of the opinion, and I would imagine most of the people in this room are as well, that private property is not necessarily the best way to do so if your overall objective is environmental sustainability or social justice. There is one argument called Coase theorem which says that private property is the way to do it because then people there's a system of rights and people can trade those rights. And Coase theorem basically says that you get a socially more optimal outcome if you leave it to that kind of trading. That's what's used as the justification for carbon trading, and as you'll see later, it's been used to sort of back up the ideology behind the kind of market-only solutions to fisheries. Why are property rights relevant to fisheries? And the main reason is that all over the world, fisheries are managed in totally different ways. I mean, from very small scale, community-run projects, cooperatives, co-managed with local government and NGO, all the way through to massive private fisheries or fisheries managed by the state. In some cases, sustainable use has been guaranteed by public bodies. In other cases, such as in Europe, it's actually done the opposite. In the European Union, the Common Fisheries Policy manages fisheries for all 28 member states. As you can imagine, that's pretty hard to do because fishing is very, very different in different areas. But that kind of centralised public body has actually failed to deliver best value for society, which is why most of NEF's effort in the last 3 years has been to catalyse debate and produce research about how fisheries can be managed in a different way. An example that kind of covers the whole spectrum was from Alaska. This was actually one of the main reasons why Alaska wanted independence, or wanted statehood, better said. In the mid-1930s, they were harvesting salmon like crazy. Within 20 years, that salmon harvest started to decline. People were very, very heavily dependent on it, and the state stepped in to manage it. The state actually failed to halt the decline. It actually got worse, mainly because, again, it was centralised. It wasn't using local ecological knowledge. It wasn't using local communities. It was a kind of top-down approach. So what the local fishing communities actually did is they lobbied the government for co-management, and they set up regional aquaculture associations so that each area would have control over their own resources, work together with government, and basically reach an agreement that was equitable and fair. It's a great example. You can read about it in a book called The Resilience Imperative, but essentially there were pressures at the time to privatise it. The same thing had been happening for salmon in Oregon, where they set up these hatcheries, which you can see this diagram on the right, which is essentially a way of catching fish, taking the eggs off the broodstock, raising those eggs up, and then letting them, and then you let them grow in these pens, and as they grow in those marine pens, they imprint, because obviously these are migratory fish, so they imprint that area, and then when you release them, they actually come back to the same area to spawn. You can catch them again, harvest the eggs, etc., etc. The difference about this towards the private model is that the local fishing associations and local communities had ownership over the hatcheries and ownership over these, the actual ocean ranching sites. What they also did is they donated or dedicated 70% of the harvest as common property to be reinvested in what they were doing. They really wanted to rebuild the stocks. They really wanted to have a flourishing fishery, not just maximise profit in the short term. So this is a great example of where ownership of an actual physical resource in that sense actually changed the outcome quite drastically. Co-management is very widespread in fisheries and marine protected areas. It's kind of, it's definitely on the up. But there's a whole different side to ownership, which is the issue of quota. It's something that people hear time and again in relation to fisheries. What it basically boils down to is who owns the fish or who owns the right to that fish. To understand that, we need to put it in the context of what happened in the UK. Back in the days when there was an absolute abundance of fish and boats just used steam power or rowing power, the fleets were small, there was no call for private ownership because everybody was getting what they wanted. There was no need for regulation. In fact, it was effectively banned to have private ownership of that form for the 1200s under the Magna Carta, and for hundreds of years after that, fishing was essentially a free-for-all in English waters. But then, as we all know, the Industrial Revolution, the shift from sail power to coal and then to fuel, the invention of new gears, monofilament line, and population growth and the growth of competition led to wide-scale declining catches. This is measured in fishing as what's called catch per unit effort, how much weight of fish you get for the amount of effort you put in. Here's some graphs from around the world's oceans, and what you see is one overall trend that the catch per unit effort is declining. There's not very many industries on Earth where if you put in more money, more technology and more effort, you get less out. Fishing is a very, especially as it's a renewable resource, it's a very kind of freakish situation. But the decline was very, very widespread in the UK. There was a race to fish as soon as it became very, very clear that the fish stocks were dwindling. Then you've got even more of an incentive to go out there and harvest them, even more of an incentive to outcompete other people, and plough more and more money and more effort into it, and you just end up dissipating the resource even faster, which is a really perverse situation, but that's the reality of where we are now. So this is the kind of the doom and gloom of European fisheries. Things were getting so bad that obviously some form of regulation was necessary. They looked at regulating gear, which you can do. They looked at regulating the seasons that you can fish in. They looked at regulating things spatially, or collecting royalties, or licensing, which are all happening in one way or another in the UK. But they also came up with the idea of quota. And from the 1970s, this has become really quite a key feature of fisheries management. What a quota does is it limits the catch per vessel. So it says your boat can only catch 30 tonnes of cod this year. The fishermen then buy or rent or lease that quota for a particular species. It's obviously quite hard to enforce because you don't really know what's going on at sea. You only know what's landed and what goes through the market in that sense. And the idea was that people or fishermen could catch according to supply and demand. So is quota really private property? I guess that's the question. And from a long time ago, people always said if you could hold on to it and if you could protect it because it was worth protecting, then it fits the definition of private property. Freshwater fisheries like ponds, lakes, rivers, obviously you can. If they're on your land, you can restrict access. Quite hard to do for the open ocean. So in English common law, it actually says we have what's called a law of capture. So nobody owns the fish until the second you've caught it and it's on your boat. And at that point, it is your private property. The big shift, and I suppose this mirrors what most of you would see as the kind of neoliberal explosion, I guess, under Thatcher or Reagan or anyone else, is this kind of change to this individual transferable quota. So really strong property rights, exclusive property rights over that quota, the power to act as an owner over it. You can sell it, you can rent it, you can lease it, you can transfer it. And obviously this is a much stronger property right than licenses, for example, or permits. There's lots of different types of them, and I could easily have spent the whole presentation just baffling you with acronyms that all revolve around TFCs, ITQs, IVQs, things like that. What it boils down to is they all have three common characteristics. They are a quota, they're individual, and they're transferable. We'll call them catch shares for this because I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I really hate acronyms. I think that they are generally quite confusing. If we just look at some of the types of quota systems that exist, you have individual ones, you have transferable ones, you have ones per vessel, you have cooperative models, you can have community-based models, and you can also have territorial use rights, which is a really big deal for First Nations communities. We'll look at an example of one of them, which is a catch share, which is a very standard kind of free market approach to fisheries, where the managers allocate a percentage of that harvest to an individual or group. They set a wide limit for what can be caught overall, and the idea is that if everybody sticks to their bit, 5 minutes, great. If everybody sticks to their bit, then that'll be a conservation gain. The main point is deregulation, and obviously it gives them the freedom to sell, but it also, as we'll see later, has some more negative side effects. It's often said of these catch shares that they're more profitable as a result of this kind of free market approach. They have met some goals. Worldwide, there's thousands of these cases. Some of them have gone well, some of them have gone less well. Overall, what the proponents say, though, is that it's really good for the profitability. It's great for conservation. It's more flexible for the fishermen, and it stops the race to fish. However, there are some issues with it. As I said right at the beginning of the presentation, what about fairness? What about equity? What about what happens to the crew shares, the impacts on coastal communities and First Nations? For example, in New Zealand, when they set up ITQs in the 1970s, Maoris had no place, they didn't own quota. So it was dished up amongst New Zealand corporations and didn't go to the people that had been using and stewarding that resource for the longest. They're promoted as a panacea for global fisheries, but one case study from British Columbia actually shows that, and shows that they're not, and advise us to take caution and also to look at some of the lessons learned from that fishery. Because what ends up happening is that these catch shares promote absentee ownership. I can buy the quota and I can just sit at home and rent it out. The price of it's always going to go up, and it basically means that the risks are taken by the fishermen, but all the profits are taken by other people. There was even a story in the news about a year ago in the UK that Manchester United supposedly owned, you know, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of quota. I mean, clearly there's something wrong there when massive corporations like that don't fish or bear any of the risk actually have control over that resource. The other thing is it gives a false sense of security to the fishermen. Having a quota doesn't give you any more legal protection than a license, and climate change and other things like that, it doesn't mitigate against climatic uncertainty, and they might lock themselves into deals like price per pound of fish, and then the oil price raises over the course of that year, and then they're actually out of pocket as a result of it. It facilitates privatisation, which, as you can probably tell, I don't think is a solution to managing fisheries, and increases the amount of capital in fisheries, because as people hold on to these quotas and let them accumulate in value, obviously when you come along and you want to join in the fishery, you obviously need more, and these intangible assets boom in the same way that property or stocks and shares or anything else do. It hurts working fishermen. The original people that get given the quota have all the power, and people that are actually working in the business lose out. It doesn't guarantee better science, and it actually offers market incentives to engage in risky behaviour when the price for example, is much higher in the winter when there's less boats out. The key things that do underpin a well-managed fishery are sound science, co-management, and for that reason, governments need to regulate quota markets, need to look at distribution, and need to see private property rights as only one type of solution. In the UK, we have a very, very weird situation where the European Union gives a total allowable catch to the UK that then divides it amongst the sector. That sounds like it makes sense, but the truth of the matter is the sector is only boats above 10 metres in length, of which there's only about 8 producer organisations that own all of that. So they get 97% of the quota, although they only represent 20% of the employment. We're seeing a similar ratio as some of the things that were mentioned in previous presentations, but what it basically is corporate ownership over a common resource. However, at the beginning of this month, there was a fairly major landmark ruling on the 9th of July this year, where the producer organisations now have to give, it's called latent quota, so stuff they're just sitting on and just speculating with essentially, but never intend to catch. They now have to give £1 million worth of that back to the small-scale fishermen. Great news, enforced redistribution, and one of my favourite lines from the ruling was, no one owns the right to the fish in the sea. Thank God for that. At EU level, they don't actually look at anything other than relative stability when they hand out quota. So this is one of the main things we were lobbying for and producing research about. We were arguing that environmental and social benefits need to be the things that determine the quota, because otherwise you're blind to the impact it's having. Through those years of lobbying, the new common fishery policy actually says that you have to allocate quota based on social and environmental criteria rather than just relative stability and financial control. And that was all down to this lobbying, which really does show that lots of NGOs and civil society working together with the right information can actually make a difference. I mean, this is not necessarily a happy ending yet. We've still got to recover the fish stocks. But the one really outstanding thing was there was a lot of lobbying pressure from these private companies during the process that we needed mandatory transferable fishing concessions, of course, because they could double their money. It was a great deal for them, but that's not actually going ahead now in the common fisheries policy. So these are two very, very positive stories. Obviously, we've got to keep a close eye on them. But in conclusion, because I've probably gone over, we need to restore fish stocks first. So we need to invest in things that will restore the fish stocks, not invest in more vessels and more capacity to do more overfishing faster. Fish are a public good and they should be managed in the best interest of society. This debate, as pretty much every other debate, is fueled by ideology. We need sound science that's respected, and good governance, and you need good institutions to manage it. As the example from Alaska showed, co-managing works with local communities and NGOs and fishermen together. And if you are going to use a quota system, you should go to those that fish responsibly rather than just those who hold the financial or social power. So I just included this because it was very interesting for me when I started working in this field that there are actually neoliberal conservation organisations. I had no idea. But here's a great example. Catch shares lifts the heavy hand of government off the oceans in favour of free markets. I mean, we've heard this kind of justification for all kinds of things. And I wonder what Henry George would have said about that.